Hi, I'm Dr. David Dobson. Welcome to Conversations. Today, our guest is Dr. Mario Gonzalez, professor of marketing at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas, with a background in economics, and his work looks at how humans build meaning. We are exploring the concept of human moat, the specific cultural nuances and emotional depths that allow brands to remain deeply authentic in an increasingly automated world. Mario, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
Mario, a decade ago, you were already exploring the impact of AI on marketing long before ChatGPT. Looking at the landscape today, do you feel more like a prophet seeing his predictions come true, or a spectator watching the rest of the world finally catching up to your research?
Thank you so much for that question. And you're being very generous, David, with those two options that you're giving me, a prophet or like an spectator, hoping for people to, catch up. Um, let me start by, sort of like painting a picture of, that I think captures where we are, at the moment, right? Just picture this, right? It's Tuesday morning, probably like 8 o'clock, and a marketing professional is sitting alone at a desk in an office that, just 2 or 3 years ago, used to be a bullpen full of copywriters, just like arguing about word choice and things like that, right? But now she's alone, and she opens a browser tab, types 50-word prompt into ChatGPT or Gemini, and then boom, in 90 seconds, she has 10 different alternatives and variations of a brand story, all complete with like simulated consumer avatars and personas, the whole gamut of A/B test angles, and the whole works, right? Now, she hasn't made a single creative decision. She has only described what she wanted, and then Shazam. So, when I wrote that chapter that you're talking about, a decade ago, almost a decade ago, um, I imagine the storm in the horizon, right? But what I did not anticipate, I think, was the speed. So, I feel definitely less like a prophet and more like someone who say like watch the weather forecast, packed an umbrella and still got soaked completely, right? But jokes aside and kind of trying to answer a little bit of, the questions that you pose. Here's what I think that this storm in question, right, has clarified for us, right? And here, thank you very much for your introduction of like my background is in economics, right? Somehow I ended up in marketing. So here I'm gonna put my economist like hat on it, right? So here's what I think, right? Like AI makes the mechanical act of producing content extremely cheap, one could say virtually free, right? So as an economist, I am trained to like when every time that something, becomes cheap or cheaper because of some like technological disruption, the relative pricing changes. And so I need to look for like what is expensive, right? Like if something becomes cheap, then the opportunity cost is like something else has become a little bit more costly and expensive, right? So I think that the scarce resource is no longer content production, right? But what is scarce now is discernment or judgment, right? Um, what am I talking about? Like this judgment is the capacity to stand in front of an audience, a specific community with its history and wounds and, unspoken expectations, and know which story will resonate and which story will land more like maybe transactional and exploitative, right? So AI is working from a rear view mirror. Like it knows what has been said, all the patterns of what has worked before, maybe even knows all the statistical grammar, of every story human beings have ever told, right? But cultural intuition is something completely different, right? Cultural intuition is the ability to feel the subtle, unexpressed shifts in a community before those shifts become data points, right? And I think this is the marketer's human contribution. And I think that gap between pattern recognition and cultural presence is exactly why the challenge of maintaining authentic brand identity has become so acute.
Mm, yeah. When you wrote your 2016 paper on the future of marketing competencies, did you imagine the transition from mechanical persona modeling to a demand of genuine empathy would happen this rapidly?
I did not anticipate that that would happen that rapidly. Like I said, right? I thought that things were gonna keep us very busy in the social media landscape, and
Mm,
that was mostly, what I focused because in back in 2017, that was basically the pervasive technology that was changing the face of marketing and the function of marketing as we know it. It was very interactive. So I made a point in that chapter to talk about how the work of a marketer was going to be more interactive, with the audience. And, I think that, I assign sometimes that chapter to my students when we're talking about brand storytelling and all the changes. And sometimes they tell me like, it's a little bit outdated, Dr. Gonzalez, because you're talking about social media, but there is AI. And I said, obviously that was written in 2017, but think about the interactional, nature of what I described back then was like the future for a marketing professional. And think about how interactive now it is, not only because of social media, but also because of AI, right?
yeah, yeah. So it's remarkable because even then you identify the mechanics wouldn't be enough. Now that the future is here, we face the challenge of maintaining an authentic brand identity when consumer personas can be easily simulated by AI. You have referenced psychologist Carl Rogers' famous line, what is most personal is most universal. If AI can perfectly model the content, as you described, how do human marketers build that human mod through empathy and emotions? And how do you achieve true narrative transportation?
Yeah. Well, that's, that Carl Rogers line is very instrumental in my teaching. I teach a course called brand storytelling, and that has become, part of our like mantra, right? And so I think the Rogers line here is doing a lot of work already, but I think it's worth if we unpack it a little bit for your listeners, right? And how it matters so much for this particular problem, right? So, what Carl Rogers understood very early, right, in his work, and this is something, like I said, that I try to bring to life for my students, is that the most personal detail is not necessarily the most obscure detail in someone's life. No, the most personal detail, it's actually the most specific one, right?
Mm,
The exact song that was playing in the background when you met your spouse,
mm,
the specific phrasing that, your grandpa told you when you left for grad school, or the specific smell, of, a kitchen or something like that, right? Like, so when a storyteller offers that level of specificity, something remarkable happens, right?
mm,
Because the listener recognizes this specificity, not as foreign, but as very familiar. In this case, the particular unlocks the universal, and so AI, right, can model the grammar of, moving from the particular to the universal, but it has no access to the lived experience that generates that particular, in the first place, right? You speak about narrative transportation, and so before we get into that, what is narrative transportation, right? So this is a psychological concept, as you know that, and it's a process that explains the deeply immersive state that where a consumer gets so lost in a story that their physical surroundings fade or, melt away, and most importantly, their critical defenses drop, right? So now, what the empirical research in storytelling, in psychology, and in marketing, has shown us is that in order to achieve genuine narrative transportation, you need a narrative world that feels like experientially real. And not real in the sense of, documented fact, but real in the sense of embodied truth, of authenticity, right? So AI can produce what I would like to call structural authenticity, right? So, the story that AI may produce will have the right architecture, it has the right emotional beats, right? It has the right cadence, right? But what it cannot produce is provenance, right?
mm,
Origin, right? Like it cannot show you where the story came from,
mm,
who lived it,
yeah,
what was at stake for the teller, right? And that matters, right? That matters because consumers have an increasingly calibrated radar for to identify the absence of provenance, right? So when an algorithm, simulates a buyer persona purely to like achieve some sort of like sales metric, right? Engagement or something, audiences immediately and inevitably smell a sell, as we say, right? Like, you know, and you know what happens
yeah,
when we smell a cell?
yeah,
Consumers immediately switch to what researchers call, what's the call? It's called persuasion knowledge.
mm,
And persuasion knowledge is almost at the opposite side of the spectrum of narrative transportation,
mm,
because persuasion knowledge is a mental defense mechanism
mm,
where like the listener shifts to, instead of experiencing the story, you start scrutinizing it, you start becoming critical of it, right? And so, you talk about the human moat in your question. So I believe the human moat or competitive advantage that you referred to in your question is built precisely on the other side of this threshold, right?
mm,
It is built from, stories of genuine self-transcendent struggle with like, emotional weight of, real stakes, right? A machine
yeah,
has nothing at
mm,
stake. And you cannot be vulnerable if you cannot be harmed. So, what is, before I go into tangents here, what is the implication for brands, of what I just said, right? In a world where AI can produce content that, is structurally indistinguishable from like human crafted work, provenance becomes a competitive asset, right? For brands to distinguish from one another, right? So the question for brands particularly shifts from what is our story to who's telling it,
mm,
from what position, and how does the audience know? Brands that make that provenance visible, like show their work, name their sources, surface their cultural relationships, these brands will hold a moat that no amount of AI sophistication, I believe, can
mm,
cross, at least at the moment, right?
yeah.
But of course, what counts as authentic provenance depends entirely on the cultural lens of the consumer, receiving it.
So when we look at the convergence of cultural and brand identities, are you suggesting that authenticity is something an algorithm can never truly feel, only simulate?
Um, I think an algorithm would be able to develop something akin to feeling it,
Mm,
but it's going to be very difficult for an algorithm,
mm,
you know, to be present inside the culture,
yeah,
right?
mm,
And being able to pivot,
mm,
when things are changing, right?
Makes sense. Those culture nuances. That distinction between simulation and feeling leads perfectly into your cross-cultural work. You have led international programs in various countries. In those diverse markets, where does a simple AI translation or standard localization usually fail to capture the subcultural nuances that drive brand loyalty?
Thank you for that question, right? Because I don't know if you noticed, I hesitated to, keep going in with your previous question, and so I think this segues perfectly, right? Um, so let me tell you something that happened to me a year ago in Japan. So, my research, as you may know, like has taken me to Japan numerous times. And last year, I had the opportunity to go and present part of my research. A friend and colleague invited me to present in Kindai University in Osaka. So I was with this friend and colleague, in we were standing on a train platform in Osaka. Now, this is Osaka, not Tokyo, right? Which matters in this story, right? Because anyone who has spent some time in Japan knows that the humor, the slang, the pace, even like the relationship to formality
Mm,
is structurally different, like 3 hours in the bullet train away from Tokyo, right? Like and even 40 minutes away from Osaka, right? Like you will see those differences, right?
I've been to Osaka.
So you've been to Osaka, right?
Been to-
So like, and they're very proud of that sort of like sub region, and their subculture forms, right? So we were standing in this platform, and right in front of us there was one of these electronic billboards, right?
Yeah.
And it was playing an ad, and it was like in a loop, right? And so we were waiting our train, and I started looking at the ad, and I was like, oh my God, I suddenly recognize that ad. And I recognized it from one that I had seen not so long ago, maybe in the airport in Houston as I was like, changing planes to go to, Osaka, or like maybe earlier in San Antonio, right? But I recognized it. But obviously it was the same ad, but with like
Mm,
Asian faces, and everything was in Japanese,
mm,
and like, even like the visual palette was adjusted. Like you could tell the architecture in the background was very Japanese. There was like a few like buildings that look very like Japanese apartments, and some ryokans and whatever, right? And I mentioned this to my friend. Like I said, like, like I recognize that ad and whatever. And he
yeah.
chuckled.
Yeah.
He chuckled, and he said that he's looked at that ad across different platforms in the past, few weeks, or, month or something.
Yeah.
And has always felt, he told me, like, I've always felt that there was something off with that ad. And
Mm,
he's like, it's not until now that you're telling me that I was mentioning the parallel with the, American, version of the ad, that he could put his fingers on it. And he said, you know what my problem is with that ad? He says, if they would have told me this was an ad from Korea or from China, I would believe it. So the localization
yeah.
in this case was done at the level of language and aesthetic surface.
Mm,
But everything below that surface was left untouched.
mm, mm, mm,
So I believe you're talking about
mm,
algorithmic localization, right?
mm,
So I believe there are four current pitfalls,
mm,
right, of algorithmic localization, right? And this that I just mentioned is number one. This is like, I call it the dialect problem, right? So algorithms translate language but misregister. Like
mm,
they miss like the hyper local tone, the generational inflection, maybe the unspoken social, protocols and etiquettes, right? In other words, they miss registering the way meaning actually moves through a specific community, right?
mm,
Osaka is not Tokyo.
yeah.
I've been to Shanghai and other places in China. So coastal Shanghai is not interior Chengdu. Lived in Spain for 10 years. Catalan is not the same as Spanish or Castilian.
Yeah.
Now these are not dialects in the linguistic sense
Yeah.
only, right?
Yeah.
They are entire cultural grammars,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And they do not appear in training data
mm,
at least in what I have observed, they do not appear in training data for algorithms
mm,
in sufficient density so to be modeled accurately.
yeah,
Now, there is a second pitfall, right? The persona averaging problem. So, like AI generated consumer personas or like
mm,
text or whatever, basically represents the center of a distribution, right? Like it's the average. But brand loyalty, particularly in subcultural context,
mm,
almost always is earned at the margins, right?
mm,
You know, brand loyalty is earned by speaking community or speaking to a community with enough precision that they feel genuinely seen, that they feel genuinely understood and heard, right? And
mm,
they don't, that makes them not feel targeted, right?
mm,
And so when you average across a culture, in this case that my colleague was saying, like, I feel like it could be from Korea or from, China, you basically erase that specificity that Carl Rogers was talking about, right? The third pitfall of algorithmic localization is has to do with temporal lag. So one of the things that I have discovered is that I'm a big fan of Harmut Rosa's social acceleration theory. So this is a German sociologist and philosopher who says that modernity right now is defined by an ever increasing pace of technology, social change, and this is forcing individuals to constantly run just to stay in place. Like he uses this like analogy of like the guinea pig on like, the wheel, you know. So if you believe that, as I do, right, like in rapidly transforming societies, cultural codes are, especially among young consumers,
mm,
shift very fast.
mm,
And so like AI is trained on historical data,
mm,
and then produces localization, but that was accurate 18 months ago,
mm,
right? When they went through the training cycle, right? But like it kind of feels off to people who are living the changes in real time. So a human that is inside a culture, updates in real time, and an AI needs to wait for the training cycle.
mm,
And then finally, right, like the fourth pitfall that I see for algorithmic localization, which I consider the deepest of all of them, is the affective texture problem, right?
mm,
So, as you know, one strand of my research examines consumer identity, or the way consumers construct and negotiate who they are in the marketplace, right?
mm,
Um, what I believe my research, shows is that identity negotiation that happens in societies by individuals is not only a cognitive exercise, but also a heavily emotional loaded process, right?
mm,
Algorithmic localization can produce a representation of a culture that cognitively is on point, right? But it cannot produce the feeling of being seen by someone who actually inhabits that culture. And the feeling of being seen is what loyalty is built on, right?
right,
So, yes, the result of those four pitfalls is what you refer to as globalized AI aesthetic, right? I
yeah.
mean, it's beautiful, it's technically competent, yet emotionally inert. It's like, I don't know what was the last time that you were in an airport, but it's like airport food, right? It's like available everywhere. It's offensive to no one, but incapable of moving you. Like there is no moment that I'm in an airport that I'm like, oh, I'm so happy to get to Houston so that I can go to this restaurant. Like absolutely not, right? Like,
Absolutely, yeah,
and so the brands winning the local markets are the ones that figure out what cannot be globalized. And
yeah,
so that particular ritual, the specific memory,
yeah.
whatever that makes
Mm,
someone says, yes, they
mm,
understand us.
mm. So, Mario, the observation of those ads shows very clearly that those cultural sign languages, how important they are. Uh, it seems the mode is built on those very nuances, and a lot of your work explores how people manage and express new identities when the marketplace shifts around them. How can brand act as navigational anchors for consumers whose sense of identity is being disrupted by this rapid technological change?
Right. Yeah. So you know, so what I would like to say here is like, let's think a little bit about the context of contemporary consumers, what we are living right now, right? Um, every morning, you and I and millions and billions of people on Earth wake up, we unlock our phones, and we basically step into an environment that is actively trying to destabilize our sense of what is real, what is true, and who we are. Right. So, I mean, you got, like, let me just list a few, right? You got deep fakes that are indistinguishable from documentary footage. You got social feeds algorithmically optimized to produce emotional arousal rather than social cohesion. You have a self concept that is being reflected back to us through like filters and metrics of comparative data that we purchased this, we watched this before, and you may like this. Truly, it is exhausting. And it's like it's an exhausting and fragmenting existence, right? And so, in this context, a brand that can offer narrative constancy or consistency, a stable story that holds still while the world accelerates, becomes something more than a product choice. It becomes a symbolic prop through which consumers assemble a sense of who they are and who they're becoming, right? Um, the brand anchors them not by providing certainty, but by providing reliable presence. Think of the brand Patagonia.
Mm,
So, like, regardless of whether you buy their jackets or their pants or, clothes or whatever, they have maintained a coherent and cohesive narrative about their values for decades. Consumers, like, who affiliate with Patagonia and with their brand story, use it as an identity statement, right? And that identity statement, what Patagonia is providing for them is that an identity statement that doesn't require constant renegotiation, right? But here's where it gets complicated, right? And where there's a responsibility for brands is so immense. To function as a navigational anchor, a brand or a brand story must reflect the consumer's cultural identity, without reducing it to a stereotype.
mm,
So, like, it must offer a stable container that the consumer can project their evolving self onto, but never pretending to know that self better than the consumer does. So, like, the moment a brand overreaches, or like the moment that a brand claims to understand a community it has only modeled from the outside, that anchor then becomes like heavy and weight. And so then the consumer doesn't feel seen, but frankly, surveilled. And the consumer doesn't feel understood, but, sort of like targeted. And so, AI generated brand stories tend to optimize for engagement, right?
mm,
But an anchor, it's not maximizing engaging. Actually, an anchor is reliably present, right?
mm,
So those are not the same thing. And so, and it's interesting to think about like how the optimization logic of AI pushes brands towards. There are two things that the optimization algorithm pushes them to. It's like novelty, things have to be new, right? And stimulation, things needs to arouse like emotions, right?
mm,
Novelty and stimulation, which is exactly the opposite of what consumers need at this point, right? They need stability, they need recognition.
yeah. So, is a brand's job nowadays less about selling a product and more about helping the consumer figure out who they are in this new world?
Well, um, maybe not, that's not their job, but I think successful brands, right, that provide structures for the consumer to integrate them
Mm,
into who they are and who they're becoming will be brands that will create, sustainable brand loyalty, among their audience, and, will perhaps grab a ticket, to probably and likely or be potentially becoming cultural icons. And that's what most brands, are trying pursuing, right? Like they want to become cultural icons so that you will remember them throughout generations and throughout your, life cycle as a brand that was present and was part of us, right? So I think, I'm not saying that every brand should be looking into, becoming part of, people's, lives, but I think if you are a brand that is embedded in, or you have products, right, that are inserted in the whole array of life cycle stages, you would do yourself, a favor, by inserting yourself in people's lives and helping them like navigate, the current identity, crises, and identity more than crisis, identity challenges that we are all facing, right?
And that kind of identity shift isn't just a psychological trick, right? You have mentioned before that our biology gets involved here. Can you walk us through how our brain physically react to that kind of storytelling? What is
Oh
happening
yeah.
during what you call neural coupling?
Yes, absolutely. Oh man, the neuroscience, here is genuinely extraordinary. I find that when I present the neuroscience to students, behind storytelling to students, something shifts, in how they think about their craft. Like, so let me, for your listeners, let me contrast two modes of communication. So to set up the science, right? Um, so on the one hand, we have factual information, right? And on the other hand, we have what we call narrative information, right? So when a brand simply disseminates factual information, like our product does X, and our quality meets standard Y, and our product is better than Z because of A, right? Our brains process this information analytically, very like left brain, right? So we become like lawyers. And I'm sorry, but I've been watching a lot of procedural shows. So like the image of a lawyer is like very present. So like we become lawyers. What do I mean by that? We're like looking for the inconsistencies. We're raising counter arguments. We're evaluating the claims against our priors, right? So this is what I, a few minutes ago referred to persuasion knowledge. I don't know if you remember, but like, the persuasion knowledge is active, right? Becomes very active. We are outside the message and scrutinizing it. We are, I guess, outside our hearts and into our brains, right? But, but when the same information is embedded inside an emotional narrative, a story, there is a character we care about. There are genuine stakes. There are specific sensory details that, drop us in like some sort of like scene or reality, right? When that happens, something really primal happens. And I'm referring to the research of Dr. Uri Hasson in Princeton. And this is the person who came up with this idea of neural coupling, right? So his research, basically, tells us that um, during a compelling story, the brain activity of the listener begins to synchronize with the brain activity of the storyteller. We literally get in the same wavelength, right? Um, Not metaphorically. I'm talking about like real stuff measurable. Like he had, and his, his associates, they have functional MRI data, right? Like proving this, right? So the listener's neural patterns begin to mirror the tellers. Now, I recently published a paper in Health Communication and in the Journal of Health Communication that basically extends or tries to extend this into a specific applied context. So what I did is with my co-author, Dr. Moriuchi from Rochester Institute of Technology, what we did, we compared audio-visual narratives against audio-only narratives, like video versus audio only, right? And we compared this for public service announcements about mental health. And what we found is that both formats were equally effective in terms of attitude change. But narrative transportation, what we just talked earlier, but narrative transportation was a stronger mediator for video, right, than in the audio only. It just seems that the combination of moving image and sound created a much more complete experiential world, which deepened the coupling. So the implication is not just that storytelling works, we know that, right? But the implication of this is that the depth of immersion is a function of how fully you construct the experiential world for your listener, right? Now, here's the part that matters most for the AI question, right? A machine, as I mentioned earlier, has nothing at stake, right? It cannot be vulnerable because it cannot be harmed. The neural coupling that produces genuine emotional synchrony requires a teller that is present to another human being who has a skin in the game, who has something to lose in the act of telling. So that biological synchrony that story creates is not a response to narrative structure. Believe me, I've studied this, right? It's not a response to narrative structure. It's a response to another human being willing to be seen, to be heard, to be understood. AI can produce a structure, but it cannot produce that presence, you know? And this is what I tell my students, like, let AI organize your research, sharpen your structure, but, help you find the right word when you're stuck, but never, never outsource the lived experience to a machine, right?
Mario, this has been a very insightful conversation at the intersection of economics and storytelling. To wrap things up, as an educator preparing the next generation of global citizens to enter an AI driven workforce, what is the one human trait or skill you hope your students never lose to the convenience of automation?
Oh, that's a very deep question. um, Well, I mean, I guess I wouldn't be making justice, to my research if I didn't answer that with a story, right? No, I want to answer that through, a moment that happened in my classroom a few years ago, because I think the abstract answer is less useful than the specific one in this case, right? This was like 3 maybe years ago, 2 years and change, when this was like the month and a half, like after generative AI really exploded into the public consciousness, when like, ChatGPT was made public and people were using it and whatever. So we were kind of like in the middle of the semester. I was teaching brand, as I teach brand storytelling, um, and so students have to create stories, digital stories, like videos, right, of different topics and whatever. And so far that semester, I had seen them, like spent days agonizing over their first draft of their scripts, like circling the page, looking at the blank page, unable to find like their opening. And then suddenly, right, like right in the middle of the semester, we had this technology and people were like experimenting with it, right? And then suddenly, students started producing in minutes what used to take them the better part of a week. And I was cool about it, right? Like I was like, if you need to use it, right? Like I was trying to learn, right? Like, I mean, I was like, I'm not going to say, no, you can't use it, right? Like, I was trying to learn about it. And so I got all these AI assisted drafts of their stories, right? And I read them. And let me tell you, David, they
Mm,
were technically very competent, right?
mm,
The structure was sound, the grammar was clean, and yet almost every single one of them was emotionally hollow,
mm,
right?
mm,
In a way that I could not articulate,
mm,
I could not put my finger on it,
mm,
but I knew they were hollow.
mm,
Like it was just impossible to miss.
mm. Yeah.
But So I went back to the classroom, and as we do, professors, right? I ranted a little bit about it at the beginning of class. Like, I read your drafts and, you know, great and whatnot, but like, there's just nothing in it and whatever. And we have this activity at the beginning of every class. It's called the story circle that I learned from, some of my storytelling mentors, in which like I give opportunity to students to like put their scripts to the test. Like if they want to read it, to the group and get like the group's feedback, this is a good opportunity, right? And so I saw this student who raised her hand and said, I would like to share mine. And I could see that she had what I assumed was like an AI assisted draft in her hands.
Mm,
And I could tell that she hesitated to read it or not. And then, in a kind of dramatic move, she put it aside.
mm,
And instead of reading it, right, she decided to share with us something more like raw
mm,
and honestly, personally risky, you know. I'm not going to relate the exact story because I like to say that what happens in my classroom stays in my classroom.
good.
But I'll tell you this, right? It was a story about her grandmother's kitchen, right? And not like, oh, my grandmother cooked traditional food and it made me feel connected to my heritage, like the kind of stuff that you will get
Mm,
in AI, right?
mm,
No, no, no. What she gave us was the specific smell of lard on
mm,
a cast iron skillet on a Thursday morning.
mm,
What she gave us was the exact phrase her grandma used when she thought that no one was listening. She gave us the particular song playing through the radio that sat on the windowsill
mm,
above the sink. She gave us details that no algorithm could have generated. You know why? Because no algorithm was in that kitchen in the first place.
mm,
At that moment, when she finished sharing her story, the room went completely still. And at that time, I had like 21, 22 students in that
mm,
class. So I looked around, and in that silence, I looked around and I watched 20 plus students, other students, kind of like nodding, like recognizing something from their own lives. Not the same memory, because it's impossible, but like the same quality of memory.
yeah.
The particular
Mm,
had unlocked the universal. In other words,
mm,
Carl Rogers was proven right in real time in my class at that point, right? So to answer your question, the
yeah.
trait that I hope my
Mm,
students to never lose is what we could call disciplined observation, the practice of paying close enough attention to their own lived experience that they can retrieve a specific detail on demand. And no, I'm not talking about nostalgia or sentiment. I'm talking about observation, a habit of noticing what is actually there in the scene, in the moment, before we even make abstract meaning or themes about it, right? AI will always be better at abstraction, no contest.
mm,
But humans are the only ones
mm,
with access to the granular sensory, culturally embedded particular
mm.
that makes abstraction feel true, right?
What a nice way to wrap up our conversation. I love this story and authenticity this story bring to this conversation.
Thank
Mario,
you.
thank you so much for joining us today. Your work reminds us that an AI-driven world, what matters most is the courage to remain culturally authentic and emotionally resonant. It has been a great
Absolutely.
pleasure having you on the show. We wish you all the
Thank you.
best in your ongoing work.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, for, inviting me to your podcast. David, this has been a treat. I was so excited to come today and meet your listeners through your podcast. Thank you so much for your kind words about my research, and I hope you also have a great week and the best on your work.